Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Executive Summit at reInvent. I'm thrilled to be joined by someone whose work, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that, has literally created the vocabulary and curriculum when it comes to AI, Dr. Andrew Yang. Andrew, all of us who have been to any tech conference in the last couple of years in this room have seen a slide with your quote that AI is the new electricity. But you said that, and you called that back in 2017, I believe. Can you tell us where we are in that journey? Are we still building the grid and the power plant, or are we sort of ready to take the value out of it by plugging in our appliances in this world?
Yeah. When I say AI is the new electricity, I meant that AI is a general purpose technology, meaning it's useful for a lot of applications, a lot of different applications, not just one or two killer apps. And it's been interesting that right now, to those of us working in AI, it feels like the growth is very rapid. If I talk to my friends building agents and agentic workflows, we're all very busy. We see the stuff working and growing very rapidly. At the same time, we also see things like that widely quoted MIT report, which I think has some methodological issues that I don't agree with, but that said that claimed that 95% of AI isn't working yet for enterprise or something like that. And I think we're in an era where the practical adoption of AI is still at a relatively low base, but the growth is tremendous. And living in Silicon Valley, we've seen how this picture plays out. There are these things that everyone says was only 1% of workloads, and suddenly it's 2%, then 4%, and 8%, and we know how that goes. And that's why, despite the caution and skepticism, I'm actually very bullish about the amount of tasks, about the amount of work that AI will be able to productively do over the next few years. But there will be years also. On the flip side, this hype that we'll have AGI in 2 years or do everything, that's also, that's just hype. And I think 10 years from now, we'll still be working hard identifying workflows that we want to automate or assist using AI and using agentic workflows.
One of the things, Andrew, speaking of agentic workflows, and you coined that term, that is a little counterintuitive, is that news cycles are typically driven by the bigger model. There's a lot of focus on the biggest model. For the leaders in this room, can you talk about when you say that agentic workflows are going to drive more progress than just the bigger model? How should we be thinking about that? What should leaders in this room should be thinking about in their org when it comes to enabling and thinking about those agentic workflows?
Yeah. It's been really interesting watching the news cycle of AI, because kind of 2-3 years ago, when AI, modern generative AI was new, there was a handful of businesses that were at the forefront, or happened at the forefront, that almost got away with saying anything. And news media, traditional media, and social media were ineffective at fact-checking them because it was difficult to know what AI actually could and could not do. And so I think the information ecosystem for AI has become very polluted with a handful of businesses that were able to drive hype for PR purposes or to try to lobby regulators or whatever. This is what I see right now. If we look at the AI stack, so much of the attention has been on the technology layer, including the clouds and hyperscalers, and then also semiconductors, and then the AI foundation models. And despite all the capex going into these technology layers, almost by definition, there's a different layer of the stack that's got to be much more valuable, which is the application layer. Because frankly, for all the technology investments to even make sense, the applications built on top of them, the applications I think many of you will be working on building on, had better generate even far more revenue so that we can collectively afford to pay for all this capex. But for whatever reason, what happened in the last couple of years as well as where traditional media and social media tends to pay attention, the application layer just gets a lot less attention. And the other interesting dynamic I'm seeing is among investors, there is a recipe for spending, $1 billion or $10 billion or whatever on capex to build data centers to power model training or model inference. So a lot of media on that. The interesting thing I'm seeing is for building AI applications, which eventually has got to be even more valuable, the cost of placing a bet is very low. So there is no recipe for deploying $1 billion to build applications. And the good news is for those of you that want to place a bet, if you want to try on an application idea, you could do so very inexpensively. But because the bets are so inexpensive to place, it doesn't drive me there the way that, some supposed $1.4 trillion plan or whatever, right, tends to drive a lot of media news cycle. So I find that if we ignore the hype and look at the business fundamentals, I'm very optimistic about what we can build at the application layer. And I'm seeing many, many green shoots. You just saw Matt's talk where, it's talked about tons of applications that Amazon's building. And I'm seeing across many businesses, tons of green shoots. But it's starting from a small base, which is why it's simultaneously true that, 95% or whatever businesses have not yet seen a material change in growth because of AI. And at the same time, there's a small number that is rapidly growing.
The point that you made around sort of the dropping point of or cost of experimentation, allowing us to place more bets. A lot of time when we talk to executives, especially in large companies, they have these list of ideas where AI could be applied. And there are scoring mechanism, weightage criteria on ROIs, but there is a lot of noise in that with hundreds of ideas that they're trying to place the bet on. What will be the mental model that you will advise the room to figure out where the cost of experimentation is dropping, but how do they place some of these bets when their team are coming back with like hundreds of ideas that they should be investing in?
Yeah, so it turns out that because of AI-assisted coding. Oh, and by the way, I know that many of you have good reasons not to, have your teams go wild with AI-assisted coding, but it is a massive accelerator. So if there's a way to make sure that you have your compliance, security, and so on policies sorted out to let your teams use highly agentic AI coders, I think that will accelerate your software teams. But partially because of that, I find that the cost of building proof of concepts has plummeted. And I feel like when I'm writing, scalable enterprise software, maybe AI-assisted coding, be it I use Cloud Code a lot. I think Hero is a good product. Maybe that will accelerate your team by like 50%, which is a huge acceleration. But when I look at what it takes to build a proof of concept, a quick and dirty proof of concept, the acceleration is not 50% speed up. It feels like a 10x or maybe even much more than 10x speed up. So what's happened is if you have an idea, the cost of building a proof of concept to test it out is very low. And what that means is, in economics, right, if something becomes really cheap, well, maybe we should buy a lot more of it. And what I'm seeing is smart teams are now increasingly saying, you know what, why don't we build 20 things? And if that's the price of discovering the two that are really valuable to then take the scale, that's fine. And if the other 18 die quick, quiet death, that's also okay. I know that there are a number of people that are lamenting that many proof of concepts in AI never make their way into production. I have a different view. I think that we can drive the cost of proof of concept towards zero, then let's have tons of proof of concepts and have them fail, quietly and in a safe way, and use that as a mechanism to discover the really valuable ideas that we then invest in taking to scale. So, one trick, one other thing I want to say that I can acknowledge though is that even though the cost of placing a bet is low, there are so many projects that have taken me, like 6 engineers, 3 months or 6 months a few years ago that now can be done by 1 engineer over a weekend, right? A couple of engineers over a couple of weeks. But the skill needed to place those bets is still high. So even though I place a lot of bets, I still regularly struggle with the decisions of which bets to place, how to govern them, when I code the project, how to set up a sandbox to make it safe to place the bets and not create downside risk to the company. So it still takes a lot of skill, but placing a lot of bets enable a lot of bottom-up innovation, as well as simultaneously figuring out what are the top-down innovation activities that are worthwhile. I just acknowledge that is really hard, but we can do it well. It is a promising recipe to try to move the needle for your overall business.
Speaking of sandbox, one of the things that you said is a sandbox first approach and sort of adding the guardrails and observability later. Now, many of the leaders in this room are from regulated industry, public sector. They're getting questions around risk management. How do you tactically create a sandbox first approach that allows you to move fast, but then when something succeeds, it doesn't slow you down then to go back and sort of add the guardrail and observability and everything that you need to get to production. If you can share some tips with this audience, that'll be great.
Yeah, so and I actually do work with quite a few, financial service institutions, healthcare organizations, and have dealt with various forms of regulations in these sectors. One of the challenges with when we run large teams, especially in large public companies, is we do have something to lose, and so we can't afford to have some engineer run some crazy prototype, release it, and be breach a regulation or leak customer sensitive data or launch some awful product that takes down the company brand or hurts company revenue. So we do have something to lose. What happens, therefore, is a lot of our businesses, before we allow an engineer to ship something, we ask them to get approval from 5 vice presidents. We need marketing sign-off, brand review, ethical review, legal review, HR review, whatever. And by the time you ask an engineer to get sign-off from 5 VPs before they can ship anything, then everything grinds to a halt, and there is no more, and you can't experiment that way. I found that a good way out of this dilemma is if you can preemptively set up sandboxes, which are environments with a constraint, with a set of rules that limits the downside risk. So it could be things like, this team will give you a $100,000 Gen AI budget, so let's not spend more than that unless you check with me first. No shipping products on the outside under the company brand. You can only test products with our internal employees, and maybe no sensitive information, right? But set up a sandbox so that the downside risk of experimenting and building products within the sandbox is limited. And it turns out that you can often create sandboxes that are very large and still enable teams to run like crazy and try lots of things. And if they then identify something that customers love, that your internal team or a few trusted design partners or whatever say this is great, only then do you have to invest the governance, other safety, security mechanisms in order to figure out how to take this scale. And just to give one example, I say something that sounds like I shouldn't be saying, but I still say it to my teams. I routinely tell my teams, don't worry about security, right, within a sandbox, because if the software is only going to run on my developer's laptop, has no sensitive information, then unless they plan to maliciously hack their own laptop, it's fine, right? But obviously, before we take it outside, we do make sure it's secure. So I think those sandboxes let teams go much faster.
By the way, the 5 approval, I don't think many people in the room can relate to that, having multiple approvals to get through that. That's a very common scenario, Andrew. And thank you for sharing how you create that sandbox and sort of shift that mindset. You talked about moving fast. Can you give us an example in your work with executives, startups, and other companies where you've seen the definition of what does moving fast mean in this new era has changed? And what assumptions we as leaders need to start questioning about the speed?
I find that most teams can probably move faster than even they are currently aware. I think Matt gave some great examples of his team at AWS moving really fast on stage just now. And one example that comes to mind for me, I was recently chatting with the CPO of a large company, energy company, and he had tasked his team with building dashboards to visualize power usage and so on. And his team estimated that it would take 3 months, a team of engineers, 3 months to build the dashboards he wanted. Because he'd been hanging out with my team, which routinely does 1-week sprints, I was very happy to hear that the CPO went to his team and said, you know what, guys, you don't have 3 months. I'm going to give you a week. So show me what you got. And guess what? His team delivered in a week. So he compressed the timeline from 3 months down to a week. And even my team, one of my team members recently, we're trying to grow global payments, doesn't matter. My team came to me with a plan for a 6-month rollout. I said, no, this is ridiculous. I want a 1-month plan. And guess what? A week later, they came back with a 1-month plan that seemed fine to me. So I find that when we work with engineering teams, AI really is accelerating the pace of development. And when we set, aggressive time boxes, and challenge our teams to do what they thought would take 3 months in a week or what they thought would take 6 months in 1 month, our teams will, not always, but very much more often than I think, I've even been surprised myself, right? Much often than we suspect, will rise to the occasion and deliver really quickly. I feel like I've been an engineer myself, and engineers like a challenge. And if you say, Your deadline is a week or your deadline is a month. Cut whatever scope you want. Show me what you got. I've been really thrilled at the number of times our engineering teams rose to the occasion and did much more than even they thought they could in this very limited time box.
It's about forcing function, but also like radically changing and shifting our own Overton window to actually think a lot more boldly, because the speed and the possibility of moving faster is just incredible. It's no longer 2x or 3x, it's 10x or more.
Yeah, and I think this is a good time to be bold, right? Because this is a moment in history over the next 2 to 3 years or whatever. There's a window to transform businesses. Hopefully you do it before your competitor does or something. And it turns out that when you place good bets, the downside risk is very low. So we place tons of bets that in the worst case, we spent 1 or 2 engineers doing something for 6 months or whatever that went nowhere, right? So financial losses for failed bet, on the order of $50,000 to maybe less than $500,000 or whatever, depending on the size of the bet. So the downside for these bets we place is actually very low, on the grand scheme of things, relative to the number of dollars we allocate to other things. But the upside is nearly unlimited. So I think this is a good time to place a lot of bets and also be bold in what we try to accomplish. And we have 2 to 3 years, I think, in this window where the set of opportunities is really rich.
I want to switch gears and talk about skills, another area that you're passionate about and help millions of people actually acquire and get ready with the skills that they need. As leaders in this room, skill development and managing and empowering the talent inside of our companies is a big concern. What is your advice, especially for non-technical roles in the companies and large companies? What are 1 or 2 skills that you would encourage leaders to go back and invest into getting their teams ready with?
Yeah, so let me say something non-controversial, then I'll say something controversial. I think the less controversial thing is for all knowledge workers, AI will give a significant productivity boost today. And one thing I've been discovering is the amount of upskilling is considerable. So for example, I see many knowledge workers today that still don't understand the difference between a deep researcher, right, versus normal LM usage. So I think having upskilling programs to teach our knowledge workers broadly across the company these skills is critical. And frankly, I run AI teams. Even some of my team members in non-technical roles, I was like, you don't know how to use a deep researcher? Well, all right, let me show you. So the amount of upskilling is significant. Then let me say the thing that's more controversial. And I've been saying this for about a year now, and I was really out on a limb when I started to say this, but I'm now very confident in this, which is for almost all job roles, certainly all knowledge work, people that know how to code will be more productive than people that don't. So I know that even earlier this year, there were people telling others, advising young people not to learn to code on the grounds that AI will automate it. We'll look back on this as some of the worst career advice ever given, right? Because as coding becomes easier, a lot more people should learn to code. And what I'm seeing already is on my teams, a lot of Silicon Valley teams and a lot of kind of teams at different businesses, the marketers, the recruiters, finance professionals, the sales reps, the ones that know how to code, they are outperforming the ones that don't. For example, one of my team's AI fund, my CFO, she's a financial officer, right? She's not a software engineer, she's a CFO. She learned to code. And so she has been writing automation software for her team so that instead of having to click through, documents to look at the decks sent in by portfolio companies, she now has automation workflows for that. And by the way, we couldn't find software to buy, right? So the build versus buy, in this case, in a lot of cases, there is no generic software out there. And so, she built something that saves the team many hours and improves our analysis of our portfolio. My best recruiters, they don't, recruiting. We actually looked at a lot of recruiting software, couldn't find something we really want to buy, but my best recruiters code, and instead of reviewing resumes by hand, they write prompts or sometimes automation software to review resumes using AI. One bizarre thing, the front desk receptionist at my headquarters office, she codes, right? She's my, she runs my reception desk, but because we had internal training programs, she learned to code. So she started doing some fun personal projects, really into fashion, built a bunch of visualizations for the fashion industry, which I thought was cool, but outside my area of expertise, but it was just cool. And then with her growing skills in coding, she wound up building web scrapers, building databases of investment firms, and she's actually building like a pretty serious, CRM now. And she's my front desk. So clearly, she's just one of the best front desk receptionists I've had, I guess, which is writing, production software. So I'm seeing for a lot of job roles, people that know how to code, and just don't code by hand, get AI to help you with it. But for a lot of job roles, and among my marketers that know how to code are starting to run circles around my marketers that don't, right? Because when they want to launch a campaign, they don't need to wait for an engineer to build a website for them. They just build a website and launch the website themselves. So I think it's worth investing. Think if you can get more people in your enterprise to learn to use AI to help them code. Because one of the most important skills of the future is the ability to tell a computer exactly what you want it to do, so do it for you. And for the foreseeable future, the language of computers is coding. So that'll be a big societal change that I think we'll have to take a few years to figure out.
That's fascinating, Andrew. I want to talk about your role as a board member for Amazon as well as other companies. Many of the CXOs in this room have a board meeting coming up. What will be your advice for a CXO talking to their board, answering questions around AI, where to place the investment, how to manage the risk? What should they be doing, and what are some tips in communicating with the boards?
Yeah, so I think, I'm actually privileged to serve the Amazon board where, Jeff and Andy already have deep expertise in AI, and the management team really knows AI. So that's really fun. I work with a lot of businesses which are growing in their understanding of AI. And so occasionally, friends ask me to give a talk to the board or whatever, and sometimes I show up to try to do that. And I think that it's great if you have a board that you can lean on, but if your board does not yet have deep knowledge of AI, I want to put forward a couple of tactics. So some of my friends that are, CEO or CIO or CTO have respectfully gone to the board and arranged for some sort of AI training for the board. All right, here's one weird story. One of my friends had been trying to convince his board to do something, and the board was skeptical. And then he called me up one day, very annoyed at me, because some of his board members had heard me say something on YouTube. And he actually said, "Friggin' Andrew, I've been telling my board for 2 years to do this and they wouldn't do it. And then they heard you say this, Andrew, and finally they're doing it." So he was actually slightly annoyed at me. But I find that if you can deliver a little bit of, convince your board to participate in some, training, it makes them have a more sophisticated understanding of AI and easier to partner with on these initiatives. And the other thing I've seen a growing number of boards do is if you can find one director, if it is a way to grow the board, to include just one board member with solid AI expertise that really influences the board dynamics as well and helps the board collectively understand this better and move forward. And I think the board does have a important governance oversight role to play, but making sure, but given that AI is such an important piece of what all of our businesses have to do, making sure that the board has some of that expertise to be a good partner, to you, that I think can help businesses move forward. So consider growing the board to have kind of an AI board member as well, if you don't already have one.
This talk, by the way, will also be available on YouTube, so feel free to share that with your board as well to gain the support. I think the data point that you talked about, Andrew, that just adding one board member meaningfully shifts the conversation is super important. There's research that backs that as well to support that. I want to, you spend a lot of time with research, startups building cool things, academia. As you look around the corner, what is something that is not yet mainstream that we may not have heard of, but that excites you?
Sure. So there's a lot, maybe the thing that excites me the most is the decade of work ahead, building applications, building agentic workflows to change businesses, to help businesses. So that's one positive thing we need to put a lot of work into. And maybe one thing that isn't widely known, kind of an anti-hype instead of hype, is if we look at the frontier models, the frontier LLMs, 2-3 years ago, there was a lot of hype about these models being general, right? AGI, artificial general intelligence, whatever that means. It turns out that if you look at the way the models are trained now, and I think 2-3 years ago, the game was let's get the models to read everything that we could get our hands on the internet, that we could license or whatever. And the internet is very general, so the models gain a lot of very general knowledge. What I see today is that the way that these models are gaining additional knowledge is much more piecemeal than most people realize. It's not. I wish we could do something, scaling laws, mumble, and they're more generally intelligent. I wish it was that easy. But the practical reality is, if you want your model, if even one of the frontier teams wants a model to be better at healthcare, you got to get a lot of healthcare data, clean it, put it in, figure out how to get it to be better at this piece of knowledge. If you want the model to be much better at financial services, you got to get a lot of financial services data, clean it, figure out how to pack it, train the model on it. If you want to be better at some specific programming language, you got to get a lot of data, build it, and just so what I see is that knowledge among frontier models today is built in a much more piecemeal way than most people appreciate. And what this means is, for businesses, this AI will be generally intelligent and do whatever your business needs to be done. I just struggle to see how that will work. But there is a lot of work ahead to build that knowledge piecemeal, right? So that's why I think, I think Matt talked about Nova Forge on stage just now. Tools like that would be important to make it more efficient for us to build these pieces of knowledge into the models to help whatever our specific business needs to do.
One personal question for a lot of leaders here. We manage the workforce, we lead the teams, but a lot of us are also parents. We have kids at home. I have a teenager at home. What will be your advice for the kids, either in school, figuring out the career choices, deciding what they need to actually go and study? What will be your advice for the future?
So one generic piece of advice that I think is true is have them learn to code. They will be much more capable and will be able to do a lot more. I think at some point, saying that you don't write code will be like saying, I don't use email. You don't have to use email, but it's kind of weird if you don't know how to use email. And people that use email can get a lot more done. And people that use AI to write code for them will really get a lot more done. And the goal is not to have everyone be a software engineer. The goal is to have people in whatever job role able to get more done with computers. And I think if we look at the buckets of value of AI, one of the clearest buckets is AI accelerated coding, and this will many people should use it. We're still in the earliest stage of figuring out what are the most effective tools for, say, MarTech, right? Issued these at Amazon's, or what are the tools that will accelerate, legal work? What are the tools that accelerate, sales work? And I think those things are slowly coming to focus. But what we're seeing with, so frankly, today, when it comes to software engineering, I would not hire a software engineer that doesn't know or doesn't use AI to accelerate their work. They're just so much less productive than someone that uses AI to accelerate their work. And this is not yet true for the other disciplines, because the best practices and the best tools in a lot of other disciplines are still slowly coming to focus. But having our kids learn to embrace it, learn to cope, but also learn to use these tools as they emerge, I think will be really important. And it is unfortunate that today a lot of universities, and I'm from academia, I've been in academia, I love academia, we're not preparing our kids for the jobs of the future. So I think today it'd be malpractice if we graduate someone with a CS degree and they don't know what the cloud is. That's just weird. But today we still graduate students with a CS major, with a CS degree, many universities do, that have never made a single call to a large language model on the internet. And I think that needs to change, because universities provide a valuable service, but we have to stop preparing students for the jobs of 2022. We need to prepare students for the jobs of 2026 and beyond. But university curricula adapt slowly. So how to work with academia, how to work with universities will also prepare our kids for the jobs of the future. And there will be tons of jobs. That's a big challenge that I think many of us as parents are still thinking through.
Andrew, thank you so much for those insights. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you once again, Andrew, for your insightful conversation.
Thank you, Ishit. Thank you, everyone.